Hey, busy bees. Today we are back with another chapter in our My Weird School series, Book 3, Mrs. Ruby is Loopy by Dan Gutman. Before we get into our chapters of the day, we're going to get into our riddle of the day. So, our riddle of the day is what likes to spend the summer in a fur coat and the winter in a wool bathing suit? Okay, and I'll say it again. What likes to spend the summer in a fur coat and the winter in a wool bathing suit? And I will give you the answer to our riddle at the end of our chapter. All right. So, yesterday we had chapter 4, Dumbheads, where they are trying to figure out who this character is, right? They said, no way, it's George Washington. He's been dead for over 100 years. But what if it's an actor acting and they've taken Mrs. Ruby and put her in the outside of the town? And this is not the real Mrs. Ruby. But then they asked Miss Daisy. Miss Daisy said, no, yes. Yes, it is. So let's pop open the book and fly through this adventure together. Chapter 5, Mrs. Ruby's Hero. Everybody in our class was excited before the next library period. We all wanted to see if George Washington would be there again. When we got to the library, there was just this lady who looked a little bit like George Washington, except she didn't have on any army uniform or a wig. She looked like a normal lady. Good morning, second graders, she said. My name is Mrs. Ruby. I'm sorry I couldn't be here the other day for your library period. But you were here, Ryan shouted. You must be mistaken, Mrs. Ruby said. I was home, sick in bed. Can we see your wooden teeth again? Michael asked. Yeah, can we? Wooden teeth? Did you know that George Washington didn't have wooden teeth at all? His mouth was filled with cow's teeth. Ew! We all shouted. I asked Mrs. Ruby, did the cow have George Washington's teeth in her mouth? But that was you, wasn't it? Acting like George Washington? Said Michael. Mrs. Ruby's forehead got all wrinkly, just like George Washington's did when we told him about computers. I don't know what you're talking about. We all looked at one another. I wasn't sure if she was telling the truth or not. If I were George Washington, would I have this? Mrs. Ruby asked. Then she picked up her shirt and showed us her belly. She had a little tattoo of a heart right over her belly button. It was cool. I had to admit that George Washington would never have a heart-shaped tattoo over his belly button. So maybe that army guy with the wig wasn't Mrs. Ruby after all. Let me show you around the library, Mrs. Ruby said. Did you know that books can take you to places you have never been before? They help us explore our world. We have books here on just about every subject you can think of. This is the fiction section. Does anyone know the difference between fiction and nonfiction? Nonfiction books are books that are not fiction, Ryan said, because non means not, like non-fat milk has no fat in it. And nonsense has no sense in it, Michael added. That's true, Mrs. Ruby said, but there's a little more to it. Fiction is what you get when you rub two things together, I said. Everybody laughed, even though I didn't say anything funny. That's friction, AJ, Andrea Young said. Fiction is a made-up story and nonfiction is based on facts. That's correct, said Mrs. Ruby, and she smiled at Andrea. I wish Andrea would shut up. Oh, who cares what the difference between fiction and nonfiction is, I said. All books are boring. Everybody went, ooh, like I had said something really terrible. But everybody needs to know how to read, AJ, Mrs. Ruby said. Not me, I said. When I grow up, I'm going to be a trick bike rider because you don't have to know how to read to do tricks on a bike. Yeah, me too, said Michael and Ryan. We told Mrs. Ruby that every day after school, me and Ryan and Michael ride our bikes together. I learned how to ride a two-wheeler in kindergarten. Now I can do a bunny hop off a bump, and I know the names of all the famous trick bike riders. I have posters of them all over the walls of my room. Gee, I don't know much about bicycle tricks, AJ, Mrs. Ruby said, but I've got posters of my hero on my walls at home too. Who is your hero, Mrs. Ruby? Andrea asked. Melvin Dewey. Melvin Huey? I asked. Melvin Dewey was a very famous librarian, Mrs. Ruby said, and her eyes got all bright and sparkly and excited. Librarians aren't famous, I said. Melvin Dewey was, said Mrs. Ruby. He invented the number system we use to find books in the library. If it weren't for Melvin Dewey, we would never be able to find anything. Wow, Andrea Young said, as if she was really interested in that boring stuff. So if you want to find books about insects, you go to number 595, Mrs. Ruby said. And if you want to find books about dinosaurs, you'd go to number 567. Libraries all over the world use the system that Melvin Dewey invented. Today we call it the Dewey Decimal System. Did all the kids at his school make fun of him because his name was Melvin? I asked. I know that if there was a kid named Melvin in our school, we would make fun of him constantly. I don't know, Miss Ruby said. But would you like to hear a song I made up about Melvin Dewey? Yeah, we all shouted. Listening to songs had to be better than reading books. Mrs. Ruby went into her office and came back with a guitar and one of those harmonica thingies you wear around your neck. She strummed a few chords to warm up. You may have heard a folk tale about John Henry, the steel-driven man, Mrs. Ruby said. Well, this is the story of Melvin Dewey, the book-sorting man. And then she started to sing. When Melvin Dewey was a little bitty baby, the first words he said himself were, I've got to get these books off the floor and put them on the shelf. Mrs. Ruby sang the whole song and played her guitar and harmonica too. It was a pretty cool song. This Melvin Dewey guy had a race with a computer to see who could sort books the fastest. Melvin won the race, but right after he sorted the last book, he dropped dead right on the floor of the library. It was cool. At the end of the song, Andrea Young got up and gave Mrs. Ruby a standing ovation, so we all had to get up too. That's the saddest story I ever heard in my life, Emily said, wiping her tears from her eyes. At the end of the period, Mrs. Ruby asked us if we had any questions about how to use the library. Is it true that if we don't return our library books on time, you lock us in a dungeon under the school? I asked. Everybody laughed, even though I didn't say anything funny. Don't be silly, Mrs. Ruby said. The dungeon is on the 3rd floor. I think she was telling a joke, but I'm not sure. And that is the end of our chapter for today. Wow. So now they actually got to meet Mrs. Ruby. So I'm guessing it wasn't Mrs. Ruby the other day when they had that army guy that they believed it was George Washington. But I'm glad that they got to know Mrs. Ruby a little bit, and she even sang them a pretty cool song. All right. So let's get to our riddle, the answer to our riddle of the day. So our riddle was, what likes to spend the summer in a fur coat and the winter in a wool bathing suit? So the answer, drum roll please. A moth. Do you know what a moth is? A moth is like a butterfly, but a moth is a little more hairier, I would say. When you look at a moth, they have little tiny hairs on them. So they spend their summer in a fur coat because they have all those little cute little hair on them. And then they spend their winter in a wool bathing suit. If you like this video, give it a like. And if you like to follow along for more adventures, hit that subscribe button. And I will see you on the next one.